And then they kind of say, you're kind of high, we'll give you meds because you probably have it or you might have it, and sure, just take these meds to prevent what you might have. I'll tell you, there are masses of people taking meds for something they don't have, and there are masses of people not taking meds that might help them who are bound for a heart attack in a few years. But because no one looked and they just took a guess. Yeah, some of the core things around heart disease and what's important in preventing it, how to measure it, how to find out your extent of heart disease, and how to fix it. You know, there's no magic fixes. It may be multi-factor intervention, but it can be managed, controlled. There's lots more new things you can do with our current knowledge. So if we look at this health span kind of thing, rather than lifespan, the average person nowadays gets to around 70. So the average, while still being really healthy and engaging in life, good shape. And I would say if you make all the right choices in nutrition and in lifestyle, you could push that curve out and be very healthy in your 80s. Let's say that's doing all the right choices. And if you do all the wrong choices and you smoke and you eat refined carb sugars and seed oils and processed food and you don't exercise, you can push yourself back to that red line and be in a lot of trouble in your 60s, and your retirement's going to be pretty crap. So there's a huge difference between making all the right choices and all the wrong ones. And that's a lot of time. And you could argue it's the most valuable time. Because out there's retirement, freedom from work, ideally, depending on how things have gone. There's grandchildren, watching them grow up. You can be a huge support to your children, your family, and you can engage in social activities. And there's just so much you can do out there if you're still healthy. If you're in bits, maybe not so good. So really, overwhelmingly, how you move those curves is in your hands. Much less so genetics for the vast majority of people. And the biggest challenge we have is atherosclerosis. So that's the inflammatory disease of your arterial wall. And that's what leads to most heart attacks. Rupture of plaque, blocks a vessel, you go down. So that's our biggest problem in the world. And last year there was I think it was Mayo Clinic pronouncement on a new paper, and they said that coronary vascular disease rates are increasing faster than our ability to address them. So mortality has been kept under control with operations and new technology, but the levels of morbidity or disease are just piling on up. Even though the smoking, everyone gave up smoking 30 years ago and they dropped heart disease, that was smoking lowering that did most of that good stuff. But now we're going back up again because we've replaced smoking with poisonous food and many other problems. Here's the arteries on the left of a very young, healthy person, and the inner wall or the endothelium is really healthy. Right? You can see there in yellow. And if we take an average office worker nowadays eating a modern diet and lifestyle, most of them will have some atheroma or atheromatous plaques. And they're basically like pustules or boils on the inner wall. And some people will have almost none at age 50, and some people will have hundreds at age 50. And the person who has a lot more of them is obviously at higher risk for a rupture. This is not rocket science. If you keep going and driving this progressive disease with what you eat and what you do in your life, things will get worse and worse, but at a certain point they'll begin to calcify. And this is not the blood calcium measure. This is your body bringing in calcium like when it makes bone, but it's bringing it in to strengthen these dangerous pustules and not have them kill you. Evolution's pretty smart. But evolution unfortunately can't keep up with the sheer toxicity of the modern food supply and other factors. You know, it didn't have to deal with those for the last 150 years. So the calcium can't quite protect you anymore because we're being too bold. Keep going and eventually you'll get small mini ruptures, thrombus, maybe asymptomatic. Your doctor won't know, you don't know, you think you're okay, but you're heading for the big one. And eventually, when you're on this road, the big one, a big blockage, and a third of first heart attacks are fatal. So that's it. And the other ones are very debilitating. Now the question is, what if you could go back though and say, hey, I sleepwalked into this and I never knew. My doctor never told me that I had massive disease and I was about to die. He just told me my cholesterol looked okay. Or she said that my blood pressure was not too bad. Because they're not looking at who has disease and who has not. If you could go back in time 20 years, this person here, and actually look at your arteries and say, well, how much calcified plaque did I have? And the more calcium I had in my plaque, the more dangerous soft rupture plaque was there. They're directly correlated. So you could have found out, wow, I got a ton of calcium, I'm the worst 2%, I'm going to have a heart attack, even though my cholesterol's low and all that. You could have found out. And if you knew, this is important, if you knew what the fixes were, you could put in the best fixes. And we know now that people are doing this. They're achieving stabilization. So instead of progressing to the point that you die, you get stabilization. The calcium doesn't necessarily disappear, it's like a scar, but it just basically stays there like a scar. And your risk plummets once you stop the progression of the disease. You don't have to take away all the stuff, that's scars, right? So if you go up to 1,000 score and you do something that I would do, and it suddenly goes 1,010, 1,020 over the next couple of years, right? You're as safe nearly as someone with a low score. Okay, that's important. Stabilization, and you can avoid that heart attack. And to be honest, you only get one life. So anyone who doesn't do this at middle age, who's a middle risk person, in my mind, it's crazy for a couple of £100 to find out if you need to do something. So coronary CAC, to find and treat the disease before the heart attack. So the cardiology business is fantastic to jump in, heroes, when someone's in an acute heart attack and save them with stents and catheters. That's great, fantastic. But they should never have had that heart attack, or they should have had an option of knowing they had disease and get the meds and lifestyle and fixes before they had the heart attack. Irish Heart Disease Awareness, a main role and my role is to get awareness out, accelerated awareness. This scan is now enshrined in the guidelines. It's all orthodox, it's just no doctors know about it. So it's basically all been ratified and validated, and no one cares or knows because there's no profit in it. It's only good for the person. It's recommended for middle risk people for over a decade in USA and England, and I would guess 99% of people won't have heard of it, and 95% of doctors won't have a clue about it, even though it's 10 years in the guidelines, US and Europe. And it's just been upgraded in the 2018 USA guidelines, which lead the world. This coronary scan has gone to 2A evidence level rating and is now being highly recommended for middle risk. So it's not just me saying it, you know, it's all being approved by all the experts. It's just no one knows. So that drives us crazy. On our website, ihda.ie, you'll see Medscape and a top doctor giving an update of 1 minute on what I just said. The new path forward. And the news is not getting out there. So I want to give an example just to give you this bizarre logic that applies in medicine. So let's say a woman was worried she had breast cancer. You know, there's some concerns, maybe some signs, and just a bit worried. What would happen? Well, of course, they'd go in and do a scan to see, is there a mass there? Is there a tumor? What's going on? Do a scan, do a mammogram. And if there is a problem, they'll follow up pretty fast, right? There's no point waiting until you have a massive tumor and metastasis in stage 3 or 4 and getting a mastectomy. You do the scan earlier to obviously treat earlier. You're going to have a way better outcome. So this is obvious, and of course this is what they do. And you know, you might get surgery depending, or you might get chemotherapy or radiotherapy. This is the way the world should work. However, in heart disease, and men or women, much more women die of heart disease than breast cancer. So I have a man picture there. It's a cliche, but men or women. What happens? Generally this happens if you're worried about heart disease. They ask you a few questions and a couple of blood tests that are loosely linked to heart disease, right? Then they kind of have an algorithm. There's a few different ones. They take a guess. No one looks. No one looks. Can you imagine? No one looks. That's bizarre. And then they kind of say, you're kind of high, we'll give you meds because you probably have it or you might have it, and sure, just take these meds to prevent what you might have. I'll tell you, there are masses of people taking meds for something they don't have, and there are masses of people not taking meds that might help them who are bound for a heart attack in a few years. But because no one looked and they just took a guess, that's the way it is. Crazy. So I'm going to invert that now just to emphasize. Let's invert this and look at it the other way around. So a woman's worried about breast cancer. Let's see would this be acceptable. And they've got a scanner, they're mammogram scanners. They say, nah, we don't like using them really, and we just don't like them, whatever reason, right? We'll ask you a few questions about your risk for breast cancer to see, are you risky for breast cancer? You know, do you smoke, exercise, you know, family history? We'll ask some and do a few blood tests that kind of link to breast cancer. And then we'll kind of take a guess then. And if you're high on the probable risk for breast cancer, we'll give you a bit of chemo, maybe a bit of radio. It sounds bizarre, but this is it. This is for heart disease. And you could have a situation that for heart disease, they give a calcium scan, 5 minutes, they see your risk, high score 20 times more likely to have a heart attack than a low score, and they immediately know, oh my God, you have good cholesterol, but you actually have a ton of calcium and a ton of heart disease. We better do something before you have a heart attack, and we're going to give you surgery or meds and get a super good lifestyle. That's the way it should work. This does not happen. Heart disease is treated like the top one. It's absurd. So CAC, to save the most at risk, you must identify them. In engineering world I come from, if you don't measure it, it don't get fixed. If you don't measure it, you can't understand it. If you don't measure it properly, you're just wasting your time, right? And it's frustrating. So here's the scan. It's around 250 sterling, but it goes up to 900 in England. So ihta.ie has all the centres and an interactive map, but the price varies hugely. The medical business is weird that way. It's the most effective measure. If you want to know if you have disease and you want to take action to save your own life, this is it, right? Price of a service for your car. Of course you'll service your car. You don't want to die if the brakes are bad. You want to find out and fix them. 200 quid, 300 maybe. Radiation is trivially low. The business that doesn't like the scan, they kind of say, oh, it's radiation. Radiologic Society risk calculator, 1 in 20,000 for the radiation for the scan of potential theoretical risk for something, which is basically 0. And that's theoretical. I've talked to physicists, professors who say it's actually theoretical. You have to call it 0 for 1 millisievert. So that's exaggerated, that reason not to have it, but that's just an industry bias. And all astronauts and presidents must have their CAC score. So there's your answer, right? For the last 6 or 7 years since they discovered how amazingly prophetic this was, right? They realized we can't have someone take office without knowing, because we don't want, a heart attack. And astronauts, you can see why. And aeronautics now, they're looking into it, for safety in aeronautics. So those people are important, so they need it, but they're not more important than you, especially not to you. Right? That's for sure. Here's the data, not too much data. The stunning thing is a 0 calcium score, which means very low soft plaque under the surface because you have no calcified yet. Your rate of heart attacks in the next 10 years is very low. You could still have an electrical problem or another arrhythmia or some other cause, and you could have a soft plaque, one of them without calcium, that could pop, but it's very rare. So you have very low risk. Note how someone in their 80s with a 0 has the same low risk in the next 10 years than someone at 50. That's kind of crazy. I love this study at Mayo Clinic. If you have a 1 to 100 score, that's pretty significant amount of calcium. You have 5 or 7 times the risk of the 0 scores. Again, the age doesn't matter. And you get a high score like my sponsor, David Bobbitt, and this is what drove him crazy, and when he spent $4 million to get this news out, he saved his own life after he found out. A high score is 20 times the risk of a low score. So keep in mind, if you've got bad cholesterol ratios, you might be 1.5 times more likely, and it's a guess. If you have high blood pressure, you might be 1.7 times more likely. It's a guess. You have high calcium versus low, you're looking at the disease, you're 20 times more likely. So hopefully you can realize only an idiot would depend on blood measures if you want to know what's going on and take action. The interesting thing I'll emphasize, a 50-year-old with a high score like David is around 20 times the risk in the next 10 years of having a heart attack as an 80-year-old with a 0. And we have guys up here, right, 78 with 0 scores. Not too many of them now, because as you get older, you get a lot of chance to get disease. And my youngest is a 29-year-old with a 600 score with the arteries of an 80-year-old. He's an American guy. They refused to scan for him repeatedly. And he pushed through based on what we've been saying, and he got it 600. And immediately they went treating him as a high-risk patient and intervening. But they didn't even want him to have the scan the day before because cholesterol looked okay. So this is the absurdity. This is where we are. David, like I say, got a high score and set up the IHTA. So again, that's why I'm here. 7 years, he said, and he's still as passionate as he was 7 years ago when he discovered this. He is outraged at millions of people dying from heart attacks when a huge amount could be identified before the heart attack. Last bit of data now. This study had risk factor guessing, or CAC could predict these foreseeable heart attacks in a 7 or 8 year study. But only the CAC saw the risk in the future heart attacks for nearly a third of the people. So if you take millions of heart attacks and tragedies around the world, CAC, if used, would be the only thing that could see a third of them. A third of a huge number, a third of huge tragedy. Well, it's a huge number, and it's huge tragedy averted. So this is the power of CAC. Now, the key is to slow or stop progression. This is a very important point. There's no point getting a high score and saying, wow, I'm at 20 times the risk, and say, just go home and crawl into a corner, right, in the ball. But the beauty is that's not the way it is. This study had high starting score people with obviously huge risk. I showed you the data. And when they increased over the years, because they scanned them every year or two, and they were increasing at more than 15% per year, so say 1,000 to 1,200 to 1,500, those guys are driving their disease process. They don't know it, but they are, right? And those people had a heart attack rate from the data of 50% in that group, right? That's double barrel shotgun, way worse than Russian roulette, okay? 50%. Now, the people who had a high score similar at the start, at huge potential risk, but over the 5 years, they managed to. 5 years pass by and they're less than 15% a year. 1,000 to say 1,060, year later 1,110, slow progression. Should be safer, right, from what I told you. Did they have a lower rate than the 50%, do you think? How about 17 times lower? They had a rate that the team noted was pretty much not much different than a low or zero score for people of their age. So even with a huge score, technically if you intervene and you stop progression, you nearly go back to the risk of someone who had a zero in the first place, which makes absolutely engineering sense, because it's not the high score that kills you or gives you 20 times the risk. It's the accelerating disease heading over the cliff. If you stop it, it just becomes scars. You got a huge score, you got a badge of honor, but you're no longer really at risk. So this is huge hope if you can do it. Can we intervene and stop progression? Because the last study, the guys didn't know why they stopped. They just kind of said, well, they seemed to stop and it was fantastic. Didn't know why. I know why. So the problem is that orthodox medicine, I have many papers, and Heinz Nixdorf is a great example. What they say is, progression of coronary artery calcification, even with drugs and treatments, seems to be inevitable but predictable. We can take your calcium score and your age and your sex and show how you will exponentially rise. And LDL does not affect how fast you rise, and even the risk factors don't, except for diabetes and hyperinsulin. But LDL has no effect, no surprise to me. But they basically said, well, because LDL and drugs for LDL doesn't seem to affect it, there's no point serially scanning. There's no point scanning, because we don't know what to do. It's written in the paper. We can't do anything, so screw it. Fascinating. And this is true. The data they got was for standard American diet eaters, essentially. And if you're not doing something special to stop the progression, that is what you will see. They're not lying. They just don't know. They don't know how it works. It's funny. So I'm going to show a clip from a documentary we made earlier this year, and there's a full movie coming out later, fairly big budget, funded by IHDA, and it has Donal O'Neill from Serial Killers, and we scanned 45 of the Irish sporting heroes from 1991. They're in their 50s now, and they're all in pretty good shape, better looking than the average 58-year-old. We saw some interesting stuff, but we didn't really expose the scores in the documentary, but we will in the movie, and we'll follow the high scorers who have reversed their disease. That's going to be the big thing. But the scoreboard anyway, these guys were all said to be perfectly healthy. The doctors had no concerns. Some of them were on meds, some of them not, but they were all seen to be perfectly fine. No high-risk people there. A half of them had zero scores, fantastic. A quarter of them roughly had significant scores that you want to watch and be careful about. And a quarter of them had super high scores, over 100. So that's similar to the population. The sporting and doesn't help them. They don't smoke. Most of them are not fat at all. Most heart attacks, you know, you can have ordinary people, you know, they didn't smoke. They kind of exercise and walk their dog. Now they're dead. They got 3 kids left behind. Must have been genetics. The biggest cop-out in the world. No one ever looked at them and intervened to help them before they died. So anyway, we got these guys and they're all going to see cardiologists now. They're getting proper follow-up. And the medical system, actually, the people we had involved were fascinated because they said, oh my God, they just weren't expecting to see that. The radiologists kind of got like a shock. But this is good. These guys are being looked after. So the reality was that Heinz Nixdorf is wrong. And the reason it's wrong is because we intervened with a couple of these people, just a few, and I have people all over the world doing this now. It's the next big thing. 4 people, men of that age, right? So what should have happened by Heinz Nixdorf is they should have all gone on, modelable, and kept going up. The next year they should have been up by 20% by the calculations, okay? However, we intervened and we got them to do what we said would halt progression. And one of them did halt a year later, basically hadn't moved. Another one actually had the same result but slightly lower, but not very significantly, but still it blew away Heinz Nixdorf. These guys should not suddenly stop just because we told them what to do. Another guy came down substantially. Another guy came down and we've scanned him again since and he's still going down. It's not just one guy, it's 4 out of 4. And we have people all over the world now sending me scans. But it's important, this is the hope. Because if you get a high score, at least you know and you can be careful and you can improve your lifestyle. But to know that this is possible, now you've got a goal. And people who are good people will take this on as a project with a high score and say, I want to do this. I want to be there 20 years later than I might otherwise be. And healthier. Because when you do the stuff that fixes this, right, it's going to lower your risk for cancer, it's going to lower your risk for all the modern chronic diseases, they're all going to lower. What drives progression? Quick look here, this is the Western world calcification distribution. Western white men, as they get older, around 10 or 20% of them get massive calcification. So take from that the Western world is riddled with heart disease. I mean, up to thousands, it's just riddled. That's the reality, and it's getting worse actually. The top 10% of calcifiers in there are over 40% of the heart attacks. I mean, it's tragic. No one's even looking. Here we have semain men, also humans. That's their distribution. Do you notice the difference? Yeah? Where's the genetics? These guys don't have heart disease. They have almost no heart attacks. The semain are famous. Someone did the scan on all of them. It's not just them. The Catavans, who are genetically different from the semain, have almost no heart attacks, no calcification. But they're genetically different. And if you take any of these guys and they come over to the Western world, within 2 generations, they're riddled with calcification. Of course, because it's not genetics. It's what goes in the mouth, but breathed into the body. It's diet and lifestyle, essentially. That's what drives. That's why heart disease exploded in the 19th, 20th century. Cholesterol never changed an iota. Heart disease went through the roof. This is it. So why? Why did they not? And I'll tell you a few reasons in blood tests. They have very low insulin levels. That's crucial. They have very low blood glucose, and their blood glucose doesn't spike after a meal like 50 to 70% of Western people in their 50s. They have no diabetic physiology. So insulin, glucose, blood insulin, blood glucose, and post-meal, postprandial spikes, they're all essentially diabetic physiology. And I'd say only 1 in 5 type 2 diabetics is currently diagnosed, right? We say we got 10% diabetics in America. For people over 50, it looks more like 70% are essentially diabetic. No hypertension. These guys over here, their blood pressure doesn't go up with age. No need for blood pressure tablets. Guy is 70 is 120 over 80. Same as guys in the 20s, 30s. Because hypertension, idiopathic hypertension or hypertension without a known cause, like kidney problem or something, it's mostly related to hyperinsulinemia, which is an epidemic in the West, so we got an epidemic of blood pressure. It's not hard to put these dots together, right? They've no central obesity because central obesity, intraorganal fat, visceral fat, that's just a classic sign of the other problems I'm talking about, right? It's essentially insulinemia, diabetes. And they don't have autoimmune conditions. So we have an epidemic of autoimmune in the West now. It's basically everywhere. Even celiac has gone up a factor of 4. The immune system is an incredibly powerful weapon. But what we're doing to our bodies now is driving our immune system crazy, and it's actually causing collateral damage, right? So this is a massive problem. They don't have it because they're just eating pork and fish and coconuts and meat and some vegetables, and they're getting sun exposure. They don't have pollution. This is the list of main causes, and cholesterol doesn't even get on my list because cholesterol is mostly a proxy for something else, Most of cholesterol value and risk is it can reflect some of these problems when it goes high. It's an indirect measure, but these are the main. And as I said, hyperinsulin, insulin resistance, and high blood glucose and spikes is the biggest thing to watch for. There's other things, but that drives most of the heart disease in the modern world, period. Quick homework, insulin resistance might be new to some of you. Google insulin resistance and put in, with insulin resistance, the disease of your choice. Cancer, heart disease, lupus, just put in anything, arthritis. You're going to have pages and pages of published science. So when I told this to a couple of doctors who are actually friends of mine back in 2012, I said, did you ever Google insulin resistance? Because they were saying, but cholesterol is a key thing. I said, guys, sorry. Google insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease, anything in the cardiac system, and come back to me. And one of them a few weeks later came back to me and said, Ivor, we've been duped. Because when he saw how important insulin resistance was, and he didn't even really know it was important, really, and he saw the relative hazards compared to cholesterol stuff, he realized it couldn't be by chance that I'm this ignorant. It's shocking. And it is shocking. You go to the world's 5 risk calculators, don't listen to me. If you had an LDL over 5, right, that's what your doctor is going to panic attack. Total cholesterol over 8, what's going to happen? Oh my God, you are a heart attack waiting to happen. But I would maintain, and I did, I put a person, a male, 50-year-old, right, high-risk person with LDL through the stratosphere, put them in 3 of the world's risk calculators, they came out as low risk. Because I just put in a high HDL, no diabetes, no family history, and I basically just put in the criteria that I know are most important, and there's no risk. If you're smart enough to get a calcium scan in middle age, especially if you have high cholesterol or any other reason you might be worried, and you put in those results into the top world's calculators that take the calcium scan result, and you have a 0. And we had people this morning in the audience who had LDLs of 8 and more, long term, with 0 scores in their 60s. This is going to start getting the clarity out there. But if you do put in a 0 score and the other stuff, high HDL, no blood pressure problems and all, you get ultra low risk for that person. It's not irrelevant. If it jumps up on a new diet, you'll have to watch to see, does that indicate some problem is happening? So, genuine primary factors, take any study. This one on second heart attacks over 7 years. They went to see, well, what predicts a second heart attack in a person who's had one? That's what you really want to know. What blood measures? Total cholesterol and LDL, they realized in the mathematics, had 0 predictive power over 7 years. Didn't predict a second heart attack at all. Hypertension, which is kind of a proxy for insulin resistance, had a 2 times, if you're high blood pressure, you are double the risk of having that second heart attack in these men. What do you think insulin might have had? Because mostly they never measured it. Measured it here. 7 times more likely to have a second heart attack if you're just higher in insulin, blood insulin. Because that's where the game is, like I told you a few minutes ago. So just insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, and the foods that cause it, that is heart disease mostly. Most people won't need to go much further than that. Dietary drivers, not too complex. I could talk all day about foods and health, but essentially what we've got are sugar, refined carbs, refined grains, vegetable oils, modern industrial vegetable oils. They're the main bad foods that drove the epidemic of heart disease, along with smoking and stuff, and leaded petrol and other stuff in the 20th century. That's basically it. And processed foods, most of the centre of the supermarket is packed with these. And the reason is they have shelf life, they're industrial chemicals almost, and they cost nothing. And when I say nothing, I'm nearly not exaggerating. Vegetable oil is so cheap, and flour and grains and sugars are so cheap, they're almost 0 cost ingredients. You compare that to getting a pastured egg, right? Or a big fatty bit of juicy lamb, grass reared. No. For shelf life and for intercontinental corporate business and food, it must be this junk. That's the problem, processed food. So if you eliminated all that, you'd be 90% of the way there before you even started. Now, I'm not saying it's easy, because most people now who have an issue are addicted to processed food. They may not know it, but like cigarette smoking, how you find out if you're addicted is, you say, I'm not going to eat it for a week, and see how you feel on day 1. And you'll find that processed food addiction is an enormous issue. People don't realize it until they try and stop. Real foods are the fixing foods, the nutrient-dense ancestral foods. They we had for millions of years. Heart disease exploded and cancer and everything through the roof, and they stayed the same. But the irony is that all of the money has been spent on egg studies, meat studies. They've always gone after real foods to see if they cause disease. But there's almost no studies, believe it or not, there's almost no studies on processed foods in the last 50 years. Exercise, fitness is going to help too, along with real food, no doubt. And there's a few vitamins and minerals. Potassium, magnesium are very important, and a lot of people are insufficient. And someone who has a high disease needs to make sure they're super sufficient in those. And vitamin K2, for someone with high disease or a high score, is increasingly looking to be mechanistically and even in the other evidence very important to help with arterial health. But I'm not going to go into too much detail here. And the quiz is, summarize the key message in only 3 words. But RFR, eat real food is fine, or real food rocks, either way. I was just trying to be contextual. So, no, thanks a lot, that's it. I'll do a quick Q&A.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see my subscribe button in the middle of the screen, a free viewing of the Widowmaker movie on the far right, and myself and Dr. Gerber's book, Eat Rich, Live Long, on the left. Otherwise, please do subscribe to the audio podcast. Thanks.